Trade policies, free trade versus protection. Why should countries formulate trade policies? Trade does not happen by accident. Trade happens by design. Design here means formulating of a trade policy, and this formulation of trade policy has certain specific goals to meet. It has to lay down certain rules and regulations that it needs to follow. It can decide the ways in which it wants to enhance its trade or to control its trade with the trading partners. Trade policies affect economic activities of a country. It can influence the working of the price mechanism. It may interrupt the price mechanism, or it may allow the free trade to the free price mechanism to work. It can affect the output of firm. It can reduce the economic vulnerabilities of the nations, or it can influence both the domestic and the foreign investments that can come into the country. It can also help the economy grow and become resilient to the trade that takes place between the nations. It can even affect the relationship between countries either positively or negatively. It can even cause trade wars between nations. So keeping all these kind of outcomes that is known of trade between nations, it is important that nations create trade policy. Heated discussions have always been between the two ideas of mercantilist and that of Smith. On one hand, the mercantilists believed that trade must be restricted, which means that imports must be restricted into the country, whereas a country should attempt to sell as much as possible as exports to the other country. This is with the intention of becoming rich or wealthy by acquiring more gold and silver, which would be obtained by the sale of goods. On the other hand, we have Smith, who believed that free trade is the way forward. Smith believed that countries must specialize in some commodity, find markets outside of the country, and bring in those commodities in which the country has got no advantage at all. David Ricardo continued his argument and said that comparative advantage should be the basis of free trade between nations. So we have the world divided between these two extremes, one on one hand protection and the other hand that of free trade. Now, when did this idea of restriction begin or protectionism begin? The First World War caused immense damage and dislocation to the economic activities of the countries. The Great Depression of the 1930s further worsened these kind of situations, and countries began to believe that opening up the economy with the free trade was one of the causes of this kind of destruction. Therefore, after the Second World War and the Great Depression, countries began to restrict their trade with other countries. This went on for some time until in 1947, the first agreement or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was formulated. Of course, today the General Agreement has been converted into the institution of WTO. Forms on one hand and restricting trade on the other has been a matter of much political debate among nations, and even today countries are debating between these two and the degree to which they would like to give this freedom to trade. Now, why do governments adopt restrictive trade policies today? Ideas are very complex, and there's no one answer to why countries adopt these measures. It could be complicated economic reasons, the nature of the products, the size of the country, the level of the country's development, the political reasons where the ideologies that the country's governments follow. It could be technical, whether the country has the technical resources and know how to produce it. It could be global strategic reasons where the country would like to become a powerful nation in the world. Now, there are many reasons why countries will follow one or the other kind of trade policy. Now, there's the issue between developing countries and the developed countries. What do developing countries want? Now, after the World War, after all that depression and so on, many countries of the world became independent from their colonial masters, rulers. So what happened to those countries which became free? What kind of trade policies did they want to follow? So this resulted in the debate among these developing countries what kind of policies they want to follow, and the dominance of the developed countries into what kind of policies that these newly free countries must follow. So this went on, this debate goes on, and today also we find that there is no one answer as to what kind of trade has to be done, but definitely it is much better than what was happening during the World War and the aftermath of World War. Today, trade policies are made in some cases on bilateral issues, but a majority of the trade agreements that are made are given within the framework of the multilateral arrangements of the WTO, which has made its movement towards freer trade on its regular agenda. It is to move towards more and more free trade. It is customary to understand what are the arguments for free trade and what are the arguments for protectionism. Free trade, we have seen through the trade theories that trade allows the specialization of labor, it allows better utilization of resources, it brings in technology, it can allow employment of resources, and a host of other reasons why free trade is suggested. But then those who advocate protectionism have got very strong reasons as to why the country should follow the principle of protectionism. And what we do customarily in international economics here is to show a set of arguments which are favoring the countries to follow protectionism, and another set of reasons why countries should not follow protectionism. So let us first look at the arguments for protectionism. Generally, we talk about the infant industry argument, and this is more or less associated with the developing countries or countries which are in the process of getting into the development process itself. So, what these countries do is they have to set up their new industries, their infant industries, and these industries have not yet been able to enjoy the economies of scale. The cost of productions are high, and they will not be able to compete with foreign goods if they come into the country. So they have to face stiff competition with foreign competition, and therefore they would prefer to protect their newly formed industries against this competition from external companies and their goods. So this is called as the infant industry argument. We also make the statement, nurse the baby, protect the child, and free the adult, so that the new baby industry are really protected from the foreign competition. The other important reason is the diversification of industries argument. This argument again comes from more, we can understand that it comes more from those kind of economies which are not yet industrially developed, and therefore these kind of economies would like to diversify their industrial base, produce all kinds of goods that the economy requires, and to see that the country in some sense can become produce all kinds of goods so that the country can depend on itself, or it can work for self-reliance. It also comes to this argument that if a country loses out the export of one or the other product in the international market, if it had diversified into other areas, then there would be some other area from where it would be able to export its goods. The other thing is that of strategic and key industries. Now, what do we mean by strategic and key industry? One is strategically whether it will allow the country to become self-reliant. For example, developing modern high technology industries which have involved R&D work, or which require capital intensive industry. Now, these industries cannot be imported from outside. So if we import the goods from outside, then the country will never be able to establish industries in their domestic economy which will allow them to produce these kind of goods. So economies are very clear, those countries are very clear that they want to establish these kind of industries for their own national well-being. On the other hand, we also understand that there are industries which are of basic nature, or they're called as key industries. Now these key industries are very important in the early stages of development, because it uses the technology from within, or it is able to use technology from outside. By establishing some key or basic industries, it will be able to set up an industrial structure. It can help in the development of many ancillary industries, which in a sense will develop the industrial structure, which can also help the agriculture sector by producing the raw material that are necessary for these kind of industries. Now, if you take the example of India, at one time, just after independence, so you find that India had gone in for this mode of protection, where India believed that it was necessary to set up these high technology or capital intensive industry, or even the basic or key industries in the country, because at that time we had no industries worth mentioning, and it was necessary that these kind of industries were set up. This must be true for all the developing countries of the world at that period in time. Then the other argument is that of expansion of home market. So when domestic industries grow, they are not very cost effective, and they need to enlarge their production, but the products may not be good enough to be sold in the international market. Therefore, it is a good idea to protect that industry, allow that industry to sell its products within the country, and so that it can dispose of its produced goods, and thereby increase the size of market. So to protect again the industries to produce goods and sell it within the economy is another reason why protection is suggested. Then protection can also help in increasing the employment opportunities in the country, because it is to enlarge production, and to enlarge the production it will require the employment of a large number of people. It can also by doing this, restricting the imports, it can attempt to achieve a favorable balance of trade. If it achieves a favorable balance of trade, then it can increase employment and income in the country, provided the country that was exporting it does not retaliate by restricting the goods to be exported from this country. Protectionism is also suggested for improving the terms of trade. So when countries put restrictions on the trading between two countries, when the rate at which the one country's export will pay off for the other country's import can be influenced by following certain kinds of restrictionist policy. Dumping is a form of international discrimination. We know that monopolies practice price discrimination. Here, it is another form of price discrimination, but practiced by international companies. What happens is those companies might have produced more than what it can consume or sell in the international market or in domestic market, and it would have found that these economies are suitable markets in which they can sell their products. In such a case, what these companies do is they bring those goods into the economy, sell it at a very low price, and attract consumers. So once these consumers have got used to buying these imported stuff at a cheaper price, it is very difficult for those goods to be produced again by domestic companies, because consumers are already used to that, and producers have moved away from the producing of those goods at all in the country. Eventually, in the long run, it does no good. In the short run, consumers are better off because they can get cheaper goods and of larger variety. But in the long run, it does no good for the economy, because the producers will have moved away from that. So countries follow this protectionism to prevent this dumping that can happen. Also, protectionism is followed to prevent unfair competition. Unfair competition could be that the exporting country might be providing some kind of financial support or subsidies to their production, so that those goods can be sold at a cheaper price in our own economy. So these unfair competition and dumping both are very harmful for setting up industrial development in the country, and to that extent the countries prefer to use restrictionist policy. Of course, the other argument is about natural resources, and we know that if a country is excessively involved in exporting one kind of product from the country using one particular kind of natural resources, it is bound to happen that that natural resource will get exhausted for all times to come. And these exhaustible resources cannot be got back again. So in such cases, it is important that the countries place restrictions on the goods that are using a particular kind of exhaustible resources. Now, having seen these are some of the arguments why countries need to follow protectionism. We also need to look at what are the arguments against protectionism. When we see the arguments against protectionism, then we can conclude rightly whether the country should follow protectionism or whether the country should follow free trade, and which will be the towards the left or towards the right. That is what we can see from this particular presentation. But we also know that there are some fallacious arguments, these are called fallacious arguments, that keep the money at home. So if we produce goods at home and if we consume these goods at home, then the money that is created, the circular flow of money that is created, will remain inside the economy. This is one of the arguments that is suggested for proposing protectionism. The other one is home market. Why do we have to sell goods outside? Our market is huge enough to absorb all the goods. In such a case, we will not develop a technology, we will not be able to develop new varieties of goods, there will not be innovations that take place. A lot of the backwardness will set in if we are to imagine that all the goods that we need are to be produced at home itself. And it is not possible to produce all the goods, so no country can ever become self-sufficient. So this argument, sometimes it is forwarded that the nation can become self-sufficient. Through the trade policies, we have seen that no nation ever becomes self-sufficient. There is always a need for trade with the other countries. So this argument is also considered to be fallacious argument. Nevertheless, many times this gets into public debates where we realize that it is important to know whether these are possible at all. The other one is national defense argument. Can we produce all the goods that are required for the nation's defense also at home? It is not going to be happening, and we cannot protect our country by producing all our war goods at home itself. So these are considered to be fallacious argument. They are not arguments against protection. They are fallacious because they are wrong in themselves. It doesn't follow the principles of international trade. Now let's look at those arguments which are put forward against protection. Why protection should not be followed? What are the reasons that nations should not follow this principle of protection? The first one is the reverse working of the multiplier. When protection is followed, then we must remember that one country's export is another country's import. So if we restrict the import of one country, then our goods to that country will also get restricted. So once this restriction begins between the two countries, then the volume of consumption and the volume of production between the country will reduce. And if it happens among all the nations of the world, the volume of trade itself will shrink, like what happened after the World Wars. So production and consumption, once it reduces, we know the economics of it, that it will reduce the employment, it will reduce income, it will reduce savings, it will reduce capital formation, and thus we can understand that the reverse multiplier will begin to work. There is a contraction of all economic activities. Therefore, those who argue against protection believe that protection should not be done. The other reason is that consumers will be forced to consume goods of poor quality, pay higher price, and lesser variety of goods because they are not they have to consume only what is produced at home. So consumers lose that freedom of consuming what they like to consume, and they have to pay higher prices for all the goods that they consume. Now, if you look at the country itself, we can understand in the early years of independence when the country was following strict protectionism, or what was called as import substituting economy. What is an import substituting economy? Whatever goods have to be imported from the other country, we wanted to produce them at home because of the arguments that we mentioned for protectionism. And the early stages of development, it was valid, but then we saw sooner or later that consumers were not benefiting from that kind of consumption, producers were not benefiting from that kind of production, and by and large, the economic activities had reached a level where it could not have continued with the policy of protection. And we say that consumers were losers, producers are also losers. There is market distortion and loss of economic efficiency. So when markets function, markets, when they allow to function freely, we believe that markets can allot the resources for its production processes in the best efficient manner. It is also effective, and the meeting and protecting the industry is a very costly affair. To protect the country from genuine competition itself has become so, not allowing the markets to function itself is a very costly affair. So this is why it is considered that market distortion is not a good idea for the country, and this makes inefficient industries grow, poor quality goods to be accepted in the market. And the other reason is that this infant industry that we were talking about, these infant industries will find no reason to face genuine competition. They would stay protected, and once a protection is granted, it was very difficult to withdraw protection of certain kinds of industries. And trade restrictions have a habit of affecting the other industries as well. If one industry is given protection, then other trade industries also seek for protection. Another very difficult outcome of this protectionism is retaliation and trade wars. Countries are at loggerheads with each other when they impose these kind of restrictions. There can be retaliatory reaction, and all of that, what we saw during the World War, can happen again. So countries are aware of this retaliatory function, that the retaliatory treatment that can be meted out to them if they practice this kind of trade policy. Of course, economic growth will come down, and it is artificially not possible to keep jobs of people. So just because jobs are available and they are working in industries, their jobs cannot be protected even though the companies are making losses. That is what had happened. In the early stages, we needed to do protectionism, but as the economy grew by, we saw that in the 80s, 1980s, that the economy was not able to sustain itself, and by 1990, early 1990, we had to open up the economy. So that is exactly what we meant. The early years of development, when planning had to be done, when the economy had to establish itself and a variety of industries had to be established, it was right to have gone in for the protectionist policy. But as the economy had moved on, had established itself, then maintaining a protected economy became a very costly affair. It leads to this high tariff that we put on the commodities that are coming into the country, will be a bane on imports. It will cut jobs, it will increase poverty and also unemployment. The Another very important outcome of this protectionism is the development of a bureaucracy, and bureaucracy, with its corruption and with its need to enforce rules, and the power mongering that happens in the bureaucracy, the wire pulling that could happen in political circles, the vested interests that grew up during the period of protectionism. So a time was useful. After that time, this protectionist policy was not useful for the country, not only for India, for all these countries which have followed this kind of protection. After a while, one by one, these countries have also given up the protectionist policy and have gone in for more free trade. No country has gone in for full free trade, they have only gone in for more free trade. Series of them, ranging from quotas and subsidies and import licensing, technical trade barriers, anti-dumping trade barriers, legislation, restrictions on FDI, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and several others. So we shall look into these tools of protection in much greater detail in the next presentation. Thank you very much. Please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't.